In the glittering halls of a Christmas party, a maid uncovers a secret so shocking it could change everything. What she does next will leave you speechless. The snow had blanketed the city in shimmering white, and the opulent mansion on the hill was aglow with festive lights. Inside, laughter and music echoed through the grand hall, where the city's elite gathered for the most anticipated Christmas party of the year. The family hosting the celebration was the enigmatic Hamiltons, known for their immense wealth and perfect public image. Yet, behind the grandeur lay a web of secrets that few knew existed. Among the sea of elegant gowns and tailored suits was a figure who didn't quite fit the scene, a young maid diligently serving hors d'oeuvres to the guests. Her name was Claire, a soft-spoken woman in her late 20s with striking auburn hair tied neatly into a bun. Claire's sharp green eyes betrayed her curiosity, even as she moved with practiced grace. Life had not been kind to her. Her father's medical debts had forced her to leave college and work multiple jobs to make ends meet. This party was just another shift, another paycheck to keep her afloat. Little did Claire know that this seemingly ordinary evening would lead her to a discovery that would unravel the Hamiltons' perfect facade and change her life forever. As Claire moved through the crowd, her gaze occasionally lingered on the Hamilton family. At the center of it all was Richard Hamilton, the patriarch, a man in his 50s with a commanding presence and salt-and-pepper hair. His perfectly tailored suit and confident demeanor hinted at his status as a financial tycoon. Beside him was his wife, Margaret, a poised woman with a radiant smile that masked her cold, calculating nature. The Hamiltons' teenage children, Eleanor and Benjamin, exuded privilege, each impeccably dressed for the occasion. Claire couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between their world and hers. The Hamiltons had everything: wealth, power, and influence, while she struggled to afford even basic necessities. Yet there was something off about the family's interactions. Richard's laughter seemed forced, Margaret's gaze darted nervously across the room, and Eleanor clutched her phone as if hiding something. It was as if they were putting on a show, a facade of perfection that didn't quite hold up under scrutiny. As the evening progressed, Claire's sharp instincts began to pick up on the cracks in their image. A whispered argument in the hallway, a peculiar locked room upstairs. Something was amiss. And Claire, unknowingly, was about to stumble upon the truth. As the night wore on, Claire found herself drawn to the upstairs wing of the mansion. Her duties rarely brought her here, but a misplaced tray of glasses gave her the excuse she needed to explore. This part of the house was quieter, away from the noise of the party below. The walls were adorned with ornate paintings, and the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and expensive perfumes. Claire's footsteps echoed softly as she passed a series of closed doors, each more lavishly decorated than the last. One door in particular caught her attention, a heavy oak door with an intricate gold handle. What struck her as odd was the presence of a keypad lock on the door, an unusual feature in a family home. She paused, her curiosity piqued. Why would a family as wealthy as the Hamiltons need to secure a room like this? Before she could think too deeply, the sound of hushed voices startled her. She quickly ducked into a nearby alcove, her heart racing. From her hiding spot, she saw Richard Hamilton and another man, perhaps a business associate, speaking in urgent, low tones. Though she couldn't make out their words, the tension in their voices was palpable. Something important was being kept hidden. After the men departed, Claire cautiously stepped out from her hiding place, her mind racing with questions. The locked door and the suspicious conversation only added to the unease she had felt all evening. She returned downstairs to the bustling party, but the luxurious surroundings now felt oppressive. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled upon something far bigger than she could imagine. Meanwhile, Margaret Hamilton was busy playing hostess, her every movement carefully calculated. As Claire passed through the grand hall, she caught a fleeting glimpse of Margaret's strained expression when she thought no one was looking. It was clear to Claire that Margaret was harboring her own burdens, though she hid them well beneath her polished exterior. The party seemed endless, with guests mingling and toasting late into the night. Claire's exhaustion was beginning to set in when a soft voice startled her. "Excuse me, miss," said Eleanor, the Hamiltons' teenage daughter. The girl's usually aloof demeanor was replaced with an unusual warmth. She handed Claire a wrapped plate of food. "For your family," Eleanor said quietly, before quickly disappearing back into the crowd. This small act of kindness caught Claire off guard. It was a fleeting moment, but it reminded her that even within the grandeur of the Hamilton family there were cracks, glimpses of something real, something human. The days following the Christmas party were uneventful on the surface, but Claire's mind buzzed with unanswered questions. The locked door, the tense conversation between Richard and the mysterious man, and even Eleanor's moment of kindness. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Despite her best efforts to focus on her work, her curiosity kept pulling her back to that door. One afternoon, as Claire cleaned the library, she noticed something unusual. A stack of papers had been hastily shoved into one of the shelves as if someone had tried to hide them in a rush. She hesitated for a moment, then carefully unfolded the documents. They appeared to be financial records, but something about the numbers didn't add up. Several transactions were marked with red ink and the amounts were staggering, millions of dollars flowing into untraceable accounts. Claire didn't understand all the details, but it was clear that the Hamilton family was involved in something secretive and possibly illegal. Just as Claire began to piece together what she was seeing, a noise startled her. Margaret Hamilton stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Claire's heart raced as she quickly tucked the papers back into the shelf, muttering an excuse about tidying up. Margaret's piercing gaze lingered for a moment before she simply nodded and walked away. The encounter left Claire shaken but determined. She couldn't ignore what she had found, but she also knew she had to tread carefully. Her position in the household was precarious, and the Hamiltons' wealth and influence meant they could easily ruin her if she overstepped. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had a responsibility to uncover the truth. As the days turned into weeks, Claire began to notice other oddities around the mansion. The staff whispered about deliveries arriving late at night, unmarked packages that were quickly whisked away to the locked room upstairs. The butler, Mr. Edmonds, seemed particularly on edge, his usual stern demeanor giving way to nervous glances and clipped responses. Claire decided to confide in her closest friend among the staff, a kind-hearted cook named Rose. Late one evening, as the two women prepared for the next day's meals, Claire shared her suspicions. Rose listened intently, her expression a mix of concern and fear. "You're playing with fire, Claire," Rose warned. "The Hamiltons aren't like us. They have the power to make people disappear, figuratively or literally." Despite Rose's warning, Claire couldn't let it go. Her curiosity had turned into a sense of moral obligation. She began to devise a plan to access the locked room, though the idea terrified her. Her opportunity came sooner than she expected. One snowy evening, the Hamiltons hosted another lavish gathering, this time a charity gala. The entire staff was busy attending to the guests, leaving much of the house unguarded. Claire slipped away from her duties, her heart pounding as she made her way upstairs. She carried a small toolkit she had borrowed from the maintenance staff, though she had no idea if she would actually be able to pick the lock. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment, her fingers trembling. The hallway was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of conversation from the party below. Summoning her courage, she set to work on the lock. It was more complicated than she had anticipated, but after several tense minutes she heard a soft click. The door creaked open, revealing a room unlike anything she had expected. It was a small office, filled with filing cabinets, stacks of papers, and a single desk with a laptop. On the walls were framed photographs of the Hamilton family, but they were different from the polished images displayed elsewhere in the mansion. These photos showed a younger, happier family, before the weight of wealth and ambition had taken its toll. Claire's attention was drawn to the desk where an open folder lay. Inside were documents that confirmed her worst fears. The Hamiltons were involved in a massive money laundering scheme, using their charity events as a front to funnel illegal funds. But what shocked Claire even more was a handwritten note tucked into the folder. It was addressed to Margaret and signed by Richard's estranged brother Samuel. The note hinted at a family rift over the scheme, with Samuel threatening to expose the operation unless Margaret put an end to it. As Claire processed the gravity of what she had discovered, she heard footsteps approaching. Panic set in as she quickly closed the folder and began searching for a hiding spot. The footsteps grew louder, and just as the door began to open, Claire slipped behind a heavy curtain, holding her breath. Claire remained hidden behind the curtain, her heart hammering in her chest. She heard the soft click of the door closing and the sound of someone moving inside the room. Peeking through a small gap, she saw Mr. Edmonds, the butler, walk directly to the desk. His movements were deliberate as he flipped through the papers on top, muttering to himself. Suddenly, his muttering stopped. He stared at the folder Claire had just hastily closed moments earlier. A flicker of suspicion crossed his face as he carefully examined the desk, his gaze shifting around the room. Claire pressed herself tighter against the wall, praying he wouldn't discover her. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Edmonds straightened up, closed the folder, and locked the desk drawer. With a last sweeping glance around the room, he left, locking the door behind him. Claire exhaled shakily, waiting several minutes before daring to move. When she finally emerged from her hiding spot, her thoughts raced. The butler clearly knew about the Hamiltons' secret dealings, and his nervous behavior suggested he might be more deeply involved than she had realized. Claire knew she needed to leave the room immediately, but her resolve to uncover the truth had only grown stronger. Returning to her quarters that night, Claire struggled to sleep. She kept replaying the events in her mind, trying to piece together what she had learned. The mention of Richard's brother Samuel in the note intrigued her. None of the staff had ever spoken of him, and his absence from the family's public image seemed deliberate. Why had he been so opposed to the operation? Had he followed through on his threat to expose them, and if so, what had happened to him? The next morning, Claire noticed something strange during breakfast. Margaret Hamilton appeared unusually tense, her usual poise disrupted by sharp movements and clipped responses to everyone around her. She barely touched her food, and Richard seemed equally distracted. It was clear that something had shifted, though Claire had no way of knowing if it was related to what she had uncovered. Later that day, Claire was called to clean one of the guest rooms, which had been vacant for months. As she dusted the shelves, she found an old photo album tucked away behind a stack of books. Flipping through it, she was startled to see pictures of a young man she didn't recognize. He bore a striking resemblance to Richard, but had a kinder, more open expression. Written beneath one of the photos was a name: Samuel Hamilton. The discovery of the photo album gave Claire an uneasy feeling. Samuel's presence in the album was a stark contrast to his complete absence from the Hamilton mansion. It was as though he had been deliberately erased from their lives. Claire decided to approach Rose again, hoping the older woman might have some insight. That evening, as the staff gathered in the kitchen for tea, Claire waited until they were alone. Lowering her voice, she asked, "Do you know anything about Samuel Hamilton?" Rose froze, her usually warm demeanor replaced by a look of alarm. She set her teacup down and glanced around nervously before replying. "Where did you hear that name?" Claire hesitated. "I found an old photo album. He looks just like Richard, but..." Rose sighed heavily, cutting her off. Samuel was Richard's younger brother. He was different from the rest of the family, kind, generous, and full of big dreams. But he and Richard never saw eye to eye. When their father passed away and Richard took over the family business, Samuel wanted to take the company in a completely different direction. He cared about people, about doing good in the world. That didn't sit well with Margaret or Richard. "What happened to him?" Claire asked, leaning in closer. Rose hesitated again, as though weighing how much to reveal. "No one knows for sure. He left the family suddenly, years ago. There were rumors about fights, threats, even police involvement. But nothing was ever confirmed. After that, the Hamiltons never spoke of him again. It was like he never existed. Claire's mind raced. Samuel's disappearance felt too convenient, especially given the note she had found. Could it be that his opposition to the family's schemes had led to something more sinister? The next day, Claire decided to dig deeper. She used her lunch break to search the library for any mention of Samuel. Tucked away in an old journal belonging to Margaret, she found a single entry that caught her attention. Samuel's idealism will be the ruin of this family. He refuses to see the bigger picture, to understand that the world doesn't reward good intentions. If he won't step in line, I'll have to take matters into my own hands. I can't let him jeopardize everything Richard and I have built. The word sent a chill down Claire's spine. The entry was dated just weeks before Samuel's disappearance. It seemed Margaret had played a key role in whatever had happened to him. As Claire closed the journal, she heard voices approaching. She quickly returned the book to its place and resumed dusting the shelves, her heart pounding. She realized that every step she took toward uncovering the truth put her in greater danger. But now, she was in too deep to turn back. Claire's hands trembled as she clutched the old journal to her chest. The weight of Margaret's chilling words lingered in her mind, making her question how far the Hamiltons were willing to go to protect their secrets. She knew she needed proof, something irrefutable to expose what had happened to Samuel. That evening, under the guise of delivering fresh linens, Claire slipped into the study once again. Her heart raced as she approached the locked desk drawer, the memory of Mr. Edmonds's earlier visit still fresh in her mind. Armed with a hairpin she had discreetly taken from her room, she carefully worked at the lock, her breaths shallow and measured. Finally, with a soft click, the drawer opened. Inside, she found a collection of files and correspondence, each marked with Samuel's name. Leafing through them quickly, she found letters written by Samuel to Richard, begging him to reconsider the company's unethical practices. One letter stood out. It was dated just days before Samuel's disappearance. In it, Samuel had written, "You've chosen to side with greed and corruption, Richard. But I won't stand idly by while this family destroys everything I've ever believed in. If you don't change course, I'll have no choice but to go public with what I know. The world deserves to see the truth." Before Claire could process the letter fully, she heard footsteps outside the door. Her time was up. She hastily tucked the letter into her pocket and closed the drawer, locking it behind her. Moments later, the door creaked open, and Richard Hamilton stepped inside. "What are you doing in here?" he asked sharply, his eyes narrowing as he noticed her presence. Claire quickly composed herself. I was just dropping off fresh linens, sir. Mr. Edmonds told me this room needed restocking." Richard's gaze lingered on her, suspicion etched into his features. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Be quick about it and leave. This room is off limits to the staff." "Yes, sir," Claire murmured, lowering her head as she hurried past him. She could feel his eyes boring into her back as she exited the room. Later that night, Claire found herself in the quiet sanctuary of her quarters, clutching the letter she had retrieved. She read it over and over, each word solidifying her resolve. Samuel's disappearance was no accident. She was certain that Richard and Margaret had orchestrated something to silence him. The next morning, Claire decided to take a calculated risk. She confided in Rose, sharing the letter and her suspicions. Rose's face grew pale as she read Samuel's words. "Claire, you don't know what you're getting yourself into," Rose warned. "The Hamiltons are powerful people. If they find out you've been digging into this—" "I can't stay silent," Claire interrupted, her voice firm. "If they hurt Samuel because he tried to do the right thing, someone has to hold them accountable." Rose sighed deeply, clearly torn. After a moment of silence, she said, "There might be someone who can help. Samuel had a close friend, a journalist named Andrew Carver. He came around often before Samuel disappeared, asking questions about the family. If anyone knows the truth, it's him." Claire's determination grew. Finding Andrew Carver could be the key to exposing the Hamiltons and uncovering what had happened to Samuel. The next day, Claire used her lunch break to make a phone call. She managed to track down Andrew Carver through an old newspaper article that listed his contact information. When he answered, his voice was hesitant but kind. "Mr. Carver, my name is Claire. I work for the Hamiltons," she began cautiously. "I've uncovered some information about Samuel Hamilton, and I think you need to hear it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Andrew replied, "Meet me at the cafe on 5th Street tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you found, and be careful. If you're poking around the Hamiltons, you're playing with fire." The meeting was arranged. The next morning, Claire arrived at the cafe, clutching a folder containing the letter and copies of other documents she had uncovered. Andrew was waiting for her at a corner table, a man in his mid-40s with tired eyes and a weathered notebook by his side. As Claire recounted everything she had discovered, Andrew listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When she showed him the letter, his expression turned grim. "This confirms my suspicions," he said quietly. "I always believed Samuel was silenced, but I never had proof. This letter changes everything." With that, Claire slipped out of the mansion and into the cold night. She had arranged to meet Andrew at a safe house he had set up, a modest apartment on the outskirts of town. When Claire arrived at the apartment, Andrew was already waiting for her, a corkboard filled with papers and photographs dominating one wall of the living room. "I'm glad you made it," Andrew said as he helped her settle in. "I've been going through the information you gave me. There's enough here to make a strong case, but we still need one final piece, something that directly ties Richard or Margaret to Samuel's disappearance." Claire sat down on the worn couch, exhausted but determined. "What about the estate's surveillance footage? There have to be cameras all over that mansion. Maybe they caught something." Andrew nodded thoughtfully. "It's a long shot, but it's worth checking. Do you think you could access the system?" Claire hesitated. The mansion's security was overseen by Mr. Edmonds, and she knew he wouldn't let her near it without a fight. But then she remembered the small control room tucked away near the garage, where the butler occasionally reviewed the feeds. If she could slip in unnoticed, she might be able to find something. The next morning, Claire disguised herself in a maid's uniform she had taken from the estate's laundry. She returned to the mansion under the pretense of retrieving forgotten belongings and made her way to the control room. The small, dimly lit space was empty, as she had hoped. Claire quickly scanned the monitors and found a cabinet filled with labeled hard drives, archived footage from the past several months. She searched for the date of Samuel's last known visit and pulled the corresponding drive. Just as she was about to leave, the door creaked open, and Mr. Edmonds appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as they fell on the hard drive in her hand. Claire's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. I was asked to clean the room, sir. The equipment looked dusty. Mr. Edmonds wasn't buying it." "Give that to me," he said, stepping forward. Claire acted on instinct. She dodged past him and bolted for the door, clutching the hard drive tightly. Edmonds shouted after her, but she didn't stop. She raced through the estate and out into the garden where Andrew was waiting in his car. "Drive!" she shouted as she jumped in. Andrew floored the gas pedal, and the car sped away from the mansion. Claire clutched the hard drive to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "What did you get?" Andrew asked, glancing at her. "The footage," Claire replied. "If there's proof of what they did to Samuel, it's on here." Back at the safe house, Andrew quickly set up his laptop and connected the hard drive. Claire paced nervously behind him, her thoughts racing. "It's all here," Andrew said as he scrolled through the footage. "We just need to find the right moment." Hours passed as they combed through the videos. Finally, they found it, a recording from the night Samuel disappeared. The footage showed Samuel arguing with Richard and Margaret in the library. While the audio was muted, the body language was clear. Samuel was angry, pointing at them accusingly. Richard's face was cold and unyielding, while Margaret's expression twisted with disdain. Then, to Claire's horror, the footage showed Richard grabbing Samuel by the arm and leading him out of the room, Margaret followed, closing the door behind her. The next clip showed Samuel being led out of the mansion by two large men Claire recognized as the family's private security. He struggled against them, but they forced him into a waiting car. The car drove off into the night, and Samuel was never seen again. Claire felt a wave of nausea as the reality of what she was seeing sank in. "This is it," Andrew said, his voice grim. "This is the proof we need." Claire nodded, though her stomach churned. "What do we do now?" "We take it to the authorities," Andrew said, "but we need to be smart about it. The Hamiltons will do everything they can to discredit us." As they planned their next steps, Claire couldn't shake the image of Samuel being dragged away. The footage was damning, but it also made her realize how dangerous the Hamiltons truly were. Claire and Andrew wasted no time. They contacted a trusted investigator with the local authorities, Detective Rachel Monroe, someone Andrew had worked with before on corruption cases. They knew she was thorough, unflinchingly honest, and not easily intimidated by powerful figures like the Hamiltons. When Claire and Andrew arrived at Detective Monroe's office, the air was thick with tension. Claire clutched the hard drive tightly, the evidence that could bring down one of the wealthiest families in the state. "This had better be worth the risk you're taking," Rachel said, her sharp eyes scanning them as they entered. Andrew handed over the hard drive and explained everything. The footage shows Samuel Hamilton's last moments at the mansion, how he was forcibly removed by private security under Richard Hamilton's orders. "We believe they had him silenced for uncovering something damaging about the family." Rachel inserted the hard drive into her computer and began reviewing the footage. As the scenes unfolded on the screen, her expression hardened. "This is damning," she said, "but it's also dangerous. The Hamiltons have friends in high places. If we move forward, they'll push back hard. You need to be prepared for that." "We're ready," Claire said, her voice resolute. "I don't care what it takes. Samuel deserves justice, and people need to know the truth." Rachel nodded. "Then we'll do this by the book. I'll start by filing a formal report and submitting this evidence to the district attorney. But you should know, they'll come after you first. Be ready." Within hours of Rachel submitting the footage, news of the investigation began to leak. Reporters swarmed the Hamilton estate, and the story quickly gained traction on social media. Richard and Margaret Hamilton, however, were not ones to go down without a fight. They held a press conference, with Richard vehemently denying the allegations and claiming that Samuel's disappearance was a personal tragedy that had nothing to do with their family. "They're painting themselves as the victims," Andrew said, frustrated as he watched the broadcast. "It's exactly what I expected." Claire, however, wasn't discouraged. "The truth is out there now," she said, "and the public won't look away this time." As the Hamilton family mounted their defense, the tide of public opinion began to shift. The leaked footage had gone viral, sparking widespread outrage. People from all walks of life demanded justice for Samuel Hamilton, and investigative journalists began to dig deeper into the family's murky dealings. The evidence was overwhelming, and cracks started to form within the Hamilton empire. Business partners distanced themselves, shareholders began pulling out, and whispers of corruption spread across every circle of high society. Detective Rachel Monroe and her team worked tirelessly, connecting the dots between Samuel's investigation and a series of illicit deals that the Hamilton family had tried to bury. With the hard drive as the foundation, they uncovered a pattern of bribery, embezzlement, and threats spanning decades. Each new piece of evidence painted an increasingly grim picture of the family's rise to power. For Claire, the fallout felt like a whirlwind. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury and control, now stood as a silent monument to the lies it had concealed. News crews camped outside the gates, capturing every moment as the investigation unfolded. Andrew kept a close eye on the situation, ensuring Claire and her family remained safe. The Hamiltons, though weakened, still had resources and influence, and retaliation was a constant threat. Claire, however, refused to back down. Her resolve only strengthened as she saw the impact of her actions. Victims who had been silenced for years began to come forward. Employees who had suffered under the Hamiltons' harsh rule spoke about their experiences, adding weight to the case. Each testimony was a step closer to justice, and Claire knew she had done the right thing. The mansion's staff, many of whom had been complicit in the Hamiltons' activities, started to cooperate with the authorities. Their confessions filled in gaps in the investigation, making it impossible for the family to claim innocence. The Hamiltons' carefully curated facade crumbled piece by piece. Richard and Margaret Hamilton were summoned to testify, their every word scrutinized by the public. Despite their efforts to maintain control, the weight of their secrets bore down on them, isolating them from the power they once wielded. As Claire watched the unraveling of the family she had once worked for, she felt a bittersweet sense of closure. Justice was on the horizon, but the cost of exposing the truth had been immense. As the courtroom drama came to an end, the Hamiltons' empire was left in ruins. The final verdict had been delivered, and the weight of the family's criminal activities had come crashing down upon them. Richard and Margaret Hamilton were both sentenced to prison, and their assets were seized by the state. The mansion, once a place of grandeur, was now up for auction. No longer a symbol of power, it was now a reminder of the lies, greed, and corruption that had haunted the family for so long. Claire watched as the media frenzy slowly faded. The victory was hard-earned, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the Hamiltons' influence waned, Claire found herself standing at a crossroads. The years of silence, of hiding in the shadows of wealth and deceit, were finally behind her. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. She sat in her modest apartment, staring out of the window at the city skyline. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft golden rays across the room. A new day had dawned, and with it, the promise of a fresh start. The events of the past had taken a toll on her, emotionally, physically, and mentally. But Claire had learned to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. Andrew stood by her side, a constant source of strength. His support had been unwavering throughout the ordeal, and Claire knew she couldn't have faced the storm without him. They had built something together in the ashes of the Hamiltons' ruin, a life free of secrets and manipulation. The thought of her children brought a quiet smile to her face. They were safe now, living in a new home, away from the shadows of the past. The memories of the mansion and the life it had once represented felt distant now. It was a world that no longer held any sway over her or her family. For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself to relax. The tension that had been a constant part of her life seemed to evaporate, replaced by a sense of peace. She had fought for what was right, and in the end, justice had prevailed. The road ahead was still unknown, but she knew she would walk it with her head held high. Andrew had started a new venture, helping individuals who had been victims of corporate fraud. He worked tirelessly to bring justice to those who had been wronged, using his skills and experience to dismantle the systems of corruption that had once protected the powerful. Claire had joined him in this mission, offering her support as he worked to bring down the corrupt forces in the business world. Together, they made a formidable team. They had seen firsthand the damage that power, greed, and privilege could cause, and they were determined to make sure others didn't suffer the same fate. Claire's resolve had been forged in the fire of her own experiences, and now she was using that strength to help others. One evening, after a long day of work, Claire sat down with Andrew to discuss their future. They spoke of their dreams of a life without fear, without secrets, and without the burden of the past. They spoke of a future where they could help others, where their children could grow up without the shadows that had haunted Claire's early years. The conversation was quiet, intimate, and filled with hope. They knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but they were ready to face whatever challenges came their way. Together, they had already overcome so much. The last chapter of the Hamilton story had been written, but it was not the end. The lessons learned, the people they had met, and the strength they had discovered along the way would stay with them forever. For Claire, the journey had been one of personal growth, strength, and resilience. She had started as a maid in a mansion full of secrets, but she had become so much more. She had found her voice, her power, and the courage to stand up for what was right. As she closed her eyes that night, Claire finally allowed herself to dream. The future was bright, and the possibilities were endless. She knew she had the power to shape her own destiny. The next morning, the sun rose over the city once again, but this time Claire faced it with hope. She had fought for her freedom, and now she would fight for the future she and her family deserved. And with Andrew by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next.